in this country, since its founding, think about Thomas Jefferson's notes of the state of Virginia. I'm going to come home. I'm trying to get there. Right? Think about, he said, I tremble for this country because of the sin of slavery. Right? He was afraid of what that meant, the divine punishment that would come for holding another human being in slavery. And he writes that particular formulation in the section on habit formation. Because he said, what happens to a child who witnesses the violence of slavery? Something is broken on the inside of such a child who experiences that. Something happens to their character, Jefferson suggests. But in that moment of fear, right, it drives policy. Think about, right, the fear of Abraham Lincoln in the second inaugural, supposedly the second founding. Think about the fear surrounding Black rage with the Black Panther Party. You know, that cover of the New Yorker where they had Obama dressed as a Muslim and Michelle Obama as Angela Davis. And they were bumping fists, and people were like, what does that mean? Did they bumped fists? Did the black people just begin revolution? Fear. Fear drives policy. The moral panics around the so-called super predators, where the data suggested was not true. What did the moral panics do? It drove mass incarceration. Think about what happened with the Central Park Five. Those babies were innocent. Their lives stolen. Think about all the millions of folk who are locked up because of fear. Fear driving policy. We can no longer be afraid. And that fear actually drives our political behavior, black political behavior. As I said earlier, we're afraid to trigger your fears. So we will grit our teeth in the moment which you say something a little off color. Our fear of triggering white fear affects our behavior. So we're masking day in and day out, walking past each other, not really seeing the humanity of the person right in front of us. No wonder we're stuck. But Malcolm X said this, and I'm going to say this in front of you guys and make you mad. I don't care. We have to stop sweet talking. But we live in a time where the superordinate value seems to be putting oneself over and against another. So all we need to think about is our presidential election. We saw what happened in Asheville, North Carolina last night, yes? Folks throwing punches at each other, claiming that folks are bigots, that folks are ugly at the core, that they're going to take America back, make America great again, and doing so in the name of a kind of ugliness that I find deplorable. Oh, there's that word. But I want to take this back. I want to take it out of the easy target, at least for someone like myself, of Donald Trump. I want to think about this in the broader context of the United States. We live in a society where we can tell ourselves that we've turned an economic corner, that we have come out of the Great Recession. And when you look at black and brown communities in this country, when you turn your attention to those who are not, quote unquote, one of you, what do we see? We don't see a community that's come out of, depression or come out of economic recession. We see a community struggling to make ends meet, right? I interviewed a young woman by the name of Christine Frazier. I write about this in the book. And Christine played by the rules, did everything right? Her husband died. She lost her job, and she couldn't make ends meet. She couldn't pay her house note. And the sheriff's office came in the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning, and they unlocked the door, and they told her and her mother and her daughter and her grandson to get out, and they proceeded to empty the house of a lifetime worth of memories, to put all of it in the yard. She said, they came into my home like I was a drug dealer, but they knew that dogs were there. And she said they told her they didn't have any place for her to go. And they said to her, you have to figure out what you're going to do. But they knew dogs were there. So they called animal shelter. And she said the pain of losing the house was one thing, but they came with a place for my dog. We live in a country, right, where we can talk about turning a corner, but there are people right in our midst, right, who are struggling to make ends meet, people who are working hard, who are honest, who are trying to make ends meet, but we disremember, we think it's their fault. Right? So in the book, I talk about the Great Black Depression. I talk about the fact that black folk lost their homes, over 240,000 homes lost as a result of the collapse of the housing market. I talk about, right, the fact that over 38%, 40% of black children are growing up in poverty. I talk about the downward mobility as African Americans experience the loss of incomes, the inability to dream big dreams for their children because they can't make ends meet. And we live in a country, right, that says we've turned the corner, right? But let me say this really quickly. Y'all all right? I don't know why you invited me here. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to tell the truth. In my mind, democracies require particular kinds of dispositions to work. But something has distorted and disfigured our national and individual character. Remember, I said there's a crisis of imagination. Imagination involves what? Not only just simply the fantastical and the creative, the imagination involves what? This ability, right, to see oneself, put oneself in the position of another. That has something to do with our characters. I want to say that something has distorted and disfigured who we take ourselves to be, and I call it the value gap. Now I'm about to get into the substance of it, taking my watch off, right? What is the value gap? The value gap is the belief that white people are valued more than others. Oh, I'm going to say it again. The value gap is the belief that white people are valued more than others. And this belief isn't the possession of loud racists, people running around with white sheets over their heads or swastikas tattooed on parts of their body. Rather, this belief animates our social practices, our political arrangements, and our economic realities. This belief that white people matter more than others distorts our characters and deform our democracy. I like to tell the story of my father, who was the second African-American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi, the place where William Faulkner honeymooned. And back then, getting hired at the post office was high cotton, right? And so he knew he had precocious kids, so he decided to move us from the east side of Moss Point to the west side, on a hill, Briarwood Circle. And as we were moving into that house, I'm playing with my Tonka truck. You remember those old Tonka trucks? I'm playing with my Tonka dump truck, and I'm making my dump truck noises, and all of a sudden I hear an adult say, "Stop playing with that nigga." And it's the first time I had been called that word in that context. So I grabbed my truck and I took it inside and I took it to my father who doesn't suffer white people easily, right? Ran outside and he did whatever he did. But that's how we typically tell the story of American racism, right? Some black family achieves the American dream. They move to a big house on a hill, and then some child is wounded by some mean-spirited adult who calls them the N-word, and then that child has to work all of her life to prove that she's not that. Oh. But that's too easy. It's too melodramatic. It's too all my children-like. My mother's favorite soap opera. Because I already knew at the age of 8 and 9 years old that we were moving from the black side of town to the white side of town. I already knew because Rose Drive, where we used to live, because the pipes are bad, every time it rained, it flooded. I already knew because the sidewalks weren't paved like they were on the west side. The baseball diamond wasn't cut as regularly as it was on the other side. The houses were smaller. The schools weren't as financed. The town, that side of town was subject to layoffs by Ingalls, the shipyard, paper mill. I already knew in the very built environment that something said that those folk over there were less valued than those folk over here. We want to look for the bad racist. right? The obvious racist, but we are making choices day in and day out, right, that sustain racial inequality in this country. My colleague Imani Perry calls it a cultural practice of inequality. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I believe the planet is actually getting warmer. All right, you feel me? It's hottest summer on record, hottest year on record. But if you look at my house, and you look at my car, and you look at my light bulbs, you look at the way I live my life, the daily choices I make, you would think I believe the planet was all right. My day-to-day behavior suggests that I am a climate change denier. So there are folks running around here who are saying that they are committed to racial inequality, racial equality, but their choices. I just want my kids to go to the best schools. The social sciences have already said that whenever you hear that phrase, it's usually a proxy for how many black and brown kids attend my school. I want my neighborhood to be safe. We know what that means. I want my property values to stay. We know what that means. Right? So it's in the kind of water, the cultural practice, the value gap is evidenced. Let me give you a quote from James Baldwin in The Uses of the Blues. Y'all all right? Baldwin clearly states what he takes to be the Negro problem. I'm talking about what happens to you if you've barely escaped suicide or death or madness or yourself. You watch your children growing up, and no matter what you do, you are powerless. You are really powerless against the force of the world that is out to tell your child that he has no right to be alive, and no amount of liberal jargon, no amount of talking about how well and how far we have progressed does anything to soften or to point out any solution to this dilemma. In every generation, ever since Negroes have been here, Baldwin writes, every Negro mother and father has had to face that child and try to create in that child some way of surviving this particular world, some way to make the child who will be despised not despise himself. I don't know what the Negro problem means to white people, Baldwin writes, but this is what it means to the Negro. What does it mean to try to construct an idea of the self in a country that is organized in every single way on the basis, on the grounds of the value gap? Not because people are mean-spirited, but it's because it's in the very DNA of the country. And this is what makes addressing the problem, I'm leaving my notes now, this is what makes addressing the problem of white supremacy, of racial inequality in this country so difficult, because we refuse to look the ugliness of who we are squarely in the face and dare to imagine ourselves differently. This is hard work. This is hard. The value gap isn't sustained by loud racists. The value gap is sustained by all of us. All of us. You don't need white people for white supremacy to work. When I'm in New Jersey and I'm driving down Stuyvesant Avenue in Trenton, I hold a set of generalizations about the people who occupy that particular neighborhood. It's known as Little Iraq. I keep my head on a swivel. Right? There's a kind of particular fear that gets generalized, that is generalized to an entire population, that informs a set of assumptions about how I interact with them. And those generalizations have policy implications. We are socialized and habituated into believing, right, certain things about certain folks. Right? I write about this in the text. Nancy DeTomaso at Rutgers, a social scientist, she did a series of interviews of white working class folk in Ohio and in Tennessee and in Jersey, I believe. And she said she was interviewing these workers, and one worker said, I'm sorry, black people are just lazy. They just want a handout. You've heard this before. It's been informing public discourse since I can remember remembering. And they don't want to work hard for anything. And it turned out that his father was close friends with the union boss who hooked him up with a job. Another interviewee, right? I'm sorry to say they're just lazy. They don't want to work. It turns out that not only his friend gave him the test that he needed to take for his job, gave him the answers to the test. And what Nancy's trying to suggest in this moment is, right, not that there is some, right, overt racism that's happening. People are just hooking up their friends and families, right? That it's what she calls opportunity hoarding, that racial inequality actually is perpetuated through social networks, right? And because we're so deeply a segregated society, our social networks are typically, 75% of our social networks are 100% homogeneous. So opportunities pass through certain networks that do not pass through others. Right? I'm just helping out my child. I'm not being racist. Right? I'm just helping out my neighbor. I'm not being racist. I said something jokingly to a friend the other night. I said, if we want to solve black-on-black crime in the United States, we just need to integrate neighborhoods. And they didn't quite get it. I said, some of you didn't get it either, right? Most crime takes place, right, because of proximity. White-on-white crime, 83% of crime that happens in white communities happens between white and unwhite people. 91% happens because our neighborhoods are segregated. If we all move together, then we'll just be criminal with each other. I don't know. Racial habits. The value gap distorts who we take ourselves to be. It blocks the way to the formation of the kinds of people democracies require. I was just talking about, with Reverend Hart Anderson, about Abraham Lincoln's rejection of the monstrous injustice of slavery, but his commitment to the belief that white people were superior to black people. And how those commitments blocked the way from him becoming the kind of human being his idea of democracy required. What does it mean in our country that we can hold the ideals of democracy, and when those ideals are extended to black and brown people, we are willing to erode the social safety net? Right? Welfare, for much of the New Deal, right, was in fact a project of Southern Dixiecrats aimed at addressing poor white Southerners. But the moment the face of the welfare state became black, as my colleague Martin Gillens writes, it became, right, an emblem of the problem with big government. What happens when we're willing to turn our backs on an idea, a robust idea of the public good, because it involves people who are not like us? It means that we're willing to throw democracy into the trash bin over the idea, over our commitment to the idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, are valued more than others. It's the value gap is at the heart of our problem. The value gap is evidenced in our habits of living, habits that define where we live, where we work. I can't begin to tell you how often I have to leave the particularity of my experience at the door in order to make white people comfortable. It's almost as if, as James Baldwin writes in Notes of a Native Son, we have to make ourselves blank in order to wash away your guilt. And so we dance this dance, America's racial theater. It's this dance so that you can't be called a racist and I can't trigger your fears. Huh? The worst thing that you can be called is a racist, even though everything that's coming out of your mouth, Donald Trump suggests otherwise. Right? We find ourselves in this dance, unwilling to confront the ugliness of who we are. Just think about this. The last piece of great legislation passed in the Great Society was the 1968 Fair Housing Act. I'm watching my time. 12 years later, Ronald Reagan is elected. 12 years later, there is the triumph of a political ideology designed to undo the Great Society and the New Deal. Did we fix the country in 12 years? 1965, the Voting Rights Act, right? By 1980, wholesale attack. We don't need to protect them anymore, right? Shelby, We don't need to do it. And what happens after the Shelby decision recently, right? We get a proliferation of attacks on voter registration, voter IDs, right? Think about it. At every turn, at every moment of progress in this country, we have seen a reassertion of the value gap. At the moment in which we give voice to the principles of liberty and equality, right, in the context of the American Revolution, what do we get in response? We reconcile those principles with racial slavery. John Adams, it is said to King George, "We will not be your Negroes." At the very moment in which he's giving voice to an idea of freedom is predicated upon an intimate understanding of unfreedom. A reassertion of the value gap. In the moment of radical reconstruction, we offer, right, a vision of multiracial democracy. What do we get in response to radical reconstruction? We get convict leasing, right? Convict leasing. You wouldn't have the city of Birmingham without the labor, the forced labor of convicts, quote unquote. People arrested for what reason, right? Slavery by another name, as Brother Blackman talked. And you get Jim Crow and a reassertion of the value gap. In the context, right, of the black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century, everyday ordinary people demanding dignity and standing. What do we get in response? We get the tax revolt in Northern California. And we get calls for law and order. Value gap. What do we get when we elect our first black president and we think we turned the corner? We get the vitriol of the Tea Party. And we get a wholesale attack, right, on the voting rights of black and brown peoples. At every turn, at every moment of progress, that progress is arrested by a reassertion of the value gap. We have to do the work, but we're afraid. We are afraid.